And you've just heard Wheel Slowly Turning by Earthtones Trio. And I'm joined by one third of the trio now, Euan Stevenson. Hello, Euan.
Hi, Alistair.
So first of all, tell us about Wheel Slowly Turning.
Well, Wheel Slowly Turning is the first single from a forthcoming album called Soundtracks. Soundtracks was commissioned as a piece of chamber music from Chamber Music Scotland and Classic Music Live Falkirk to celebrate, well, it's my hometown of Falkirk. So initially the inspiration was the core path network around Falkirk. Falkirk has got all these pathways that are now being utilised for recreational purposes, and there are so many things to see and do in Falkirk. The paths all lead to these places like the Kelpies, the Antonine Wall, Calendar House, the Falkirk Wheel. And I wanted to write a suite of 9 pieces, it turned out, celebrating Falkirk, and these paths and the landmarks. And because I'm a Falkirk bairn, I'm from Falkirk, grew up there, it became a sort of love letter to my hometown in some ways on a personal level, and then on a sort of more universal level, it draws attention to these wonderful landmarks and the history of the area.
I was thinking it must have been almost a dream commission for you to get that opportunity.
It was, yeah. It was a strange process. I was writing it right during, it was the lockdown of summer 2020. So it was when we were really locked down. So it was a great time for me to be working on a large scale work like this, because all my performing work dried up, of course. So I had the luxury of time to stay at home and write. And all, when you're digging deep into your past, I suppose I was letting my imagination wander freely, thinking about growing up in Falkirk, and lots of themes just emerged quite serendipitously. I suppose they were unexpected things, like I wrote a piece that was inspired by Nino Rota's music for The Godfather, and that was because there was this sense that there was, or there still is, but certainly back when I was growing up, a real Italian community presence in Falkirk, and probably the generations prior to me would have been even more aware of that. So there was homages to, as I say, the community of Falkirk, and in this instance I wrote a piece called La Scotia, dedicated to the first generation Italians that arrived in central Scotland at the turn of the 20th century. And the music, as I say, is inspired by Rota's music for The Godfather, which I've always loved, that sort of the theme he has when you see the young Vito Corleone arrive in New York. So that was one of the pieces. There are 8 others, and Wheel Slowly Turning, which we've just heard, was inspired by the Falkirk Wheel.
So was it quite easy to pick the places or the things that you were going to write about? Keep it to mind.
Well, because I had time, the way I work is I tend to sit at the piano and improvise, and ideas emerge, and you capture ideas that seem to have certain substance to them and then develop them. But quite often it wasn't that I was setting out to write about, say, the Wheel or the Italian community or Calendar House, but a musical motif would lend itself to that landmark or theme. So with Wheel Slowly Turning, obviously I visited the Wheel many times before. I didn't actually visit it during the heart of lockdown because I was in Glasgow. But I remembered that it has this very graceful feel about it. It's a huge piece of engineering, very heavy, and lifts considerable weights, of course. But it uses very little energy, so there's a certain grace to it. And so the piece that you heard there, it's quite meditative. It's kind of gently undulates, I suppose, which is a bit like the Falkirk Wheel in my perception of it, anyway. But I wanted to get across the symmetry of the wheel as well, the sense of balance. So I had the musical entries are quite well balanced. There's flute and then cello mimic one another. And for the music nerds out there, it might be interesting, certainly interesting to me, but the cycle of fifths, which our Western music's based upon, the key center starts in B minor and ends up in F minor, which is a 180 degrees rotation, which is exactly the same as the Falkirk wheel. So those sort of things, you don't, well, I certainly don't sit down and, say this is what I'm going to do. These things tend to happen, and then I kind of analyze them afterwards and say, oh, that's interesting that that's happened.
Well, fantastic. And we should mention the other members of the trio, and I'll ask you as well how the Earthtones Trio came about.
Yeah, well, I'm very fortunate to be working with two principals of the Royal Scottish National Orchestra. So principal flautist Catherine Bryan, she takes the flute role. She's a really wonderful, captivating performer. And we also have Betsy Taylor, who I've worked with for a long time over various projects, with a project from the past called New Focus, which still exists actually as a duo. But back then it was with string quartet, jazz quartet and harp. And I've continued to work with Betsy, and it was really actually from doing some duo stuff with Betsy that the idea emerged to add a third voice. That was when we thought about Catherine. Normally the piano trio in a classical format would be violin, cello and piano. Right. So this is a slightly different combination. But it works well as a combination because you have this, the flute is like the woodwind of the orchestra, you've got cello as covering the strings, and the piano is a kind of binding force. So I find it a very satisfying lineup to write for, and great fun to play with them.
And have you played it live? I think you have played it live now, haven't you? You did a gig in Falkirk.
Yeah, the premiere, which was delayed by about a year and a half actually, it took place in the Trinity Church, which is in the heart of Falkirk. And when was that? Last month, 24th of April. So it was a kind of big relief to finally get the music out there, and it was really well received by the good people of Falkirk. They turned up to support it, and I was very nervous because it's very one, you're playing to a home crowd, so you feel the scrutiny of people that you know, and also it's new music, and it's about 40 minutes in total soundtrack. So it's asking a lot of people to endure new music for the first time. But I'm pleased to report that the feedback was really positive and people really enjoyed the music. So I'm really pleased. I want to try and get some more gigs for the trio for this project.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Is there plans to tour it, or even just play a few more gigs?
Well, yes, we have. There's always scheduling difficulties with the RSNO because they the girls have commitments there. But it may be that I have to think of an alternate lineup I'm freelance, so I tend to have a bit more flexibility. So there isn't, I don't think there's a live performance in the book as we speak, but we are going to be doing a radio broadcast on Radio Scotland later in the year. So that'll be a live performance of sorts. And
give us a little bit of background into your life as a musician. How did you get into doing what you do?
Well, I grew up in quite a musical family. I suppose my grandmother was a piano teacher. So there was a piano in our house, and there was a big grand piano in her house. Her cousin was Muir Matheson, who's quite a famous figure in the music and film world. He conducted over 1,000 films. So he was, including Vertigo, by the way. That was a big claim to fame, Hitchcock's Vertigo. So there's music in the family, writing music for film, which I also do, film and animation. So it was just natural the piano was there, and I just remember as soon as I was old enough to reach the keys, I was trying to make some kind of music at the piano, and I've just been addicted to it ever since.
And did you go, have you been through a conservatoire or something like that as well? Have you had that kind of education?
Yeah, I did the classical grades growing up on piano was the main instrument, and then I went to Birmingham Conservatoire, where I was actually enrolled in the jazz course, and then I actually switched to do a classical course at Birmingham University. So I've always, that's kind of really, I suppose that's symptomatic of my career. I always have one foot in the jazz camp and one foot in the classical camp. So I'm often playing jazz piano. Right now I have a lot of concerts with Georgia Cecile, who's doing really well in the jazz world, and we've written music for over a decade together, you know, and so we finally got the album Only the Lover Sings out last year. Won Best Album at the Scottish Jazz Awards, and I think the following month we got this amazing opportunity to support Gregory Porter at the Royal Albert Hall. So we did 4 concerts there performing this music that we'd written. So I enjoy that side of my life where I'm performing and playing jazz. I have the freedom of improvisation there and the songwriting, and then I love the more scripted element of writing for classical musicians, where obviously there's less improvisation, but there's much more sculpting of the music beforehand, and I love that. And I do lots of arranging work and things for orchestral things. I'm down south now. I moved down to Surrey just before Christmas last year, and I'm picking up work for arranging work down here and also playing. So it's an interesting time.
I've been talking to quite a lot of jazz musicians recently for a chapter in a book, actually. So I'm interested in how you feel jazz at the moment in Scotland feels like it's having a real moment. You know, it's really some amazing musicians out there, a lot of kind of crossing of genres like you're talking about. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think there is. I think there always has been a lot of jazz talent in Scotland. I mean, because it's a small scene, one of the things that I noticed coming up through the scene was that there was an amazing adaptability. You know, people, you know, it's too small a scene to specialize in one particular discipline.
Yeah.
So you end up with, you know, this, I can reel off a list of 10 piano players who are all, you know, sort of world-class musicians that are from Scotland, and they can all play in so many different styles.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's, you know, that's inspiring. And I think there's now a generation who have grown up, and you know, they're coming through, and they're not afraid to cross genres. I think that's certainly evident, and the talent's there, and I think there's a good work ethic there as well. And it's great to see some of that, you know, filtering beyond Scotland down into the UK and beyond. So it's a great time.
I agree, very exciting time. Euan, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I really do appreciate it.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Alistair.
And this is Earthtones Trio and Air in D minor.